Crude Buster, known as 2 Crude outside Japan, is a side-scrolling beat-em-up released in 1990 by Data East. A port for the Mega Drive also came out in 1992, which changed the name yet again to 2 Crude Dudes. This confusing nomenclature extends to the game's creator, also Akira Otani. He's credited as Otami with an M on the wiki. Another site drops the H in his name. Moby Games has 2 Akira Otanis listed. One works for Nintendo. Another, who I'm pretty sure is the Otani we are looking for, has a credit for Chelnov, Atomic Runner, the port presumably, since that game came out in 1988 initially, and High Seas Havoc in 1993, as well as Crude Buster. The fact that he seems to have created only 3 games over the span of just a few years in the early 1990s probably accounts for why we don't know more about him, and the fact no one is quite sure what his real name is. I'm going to go with what it says in the credits for the game, Otani, with a H and an N. Whatever his true identity may be, the game he created is one I remember clearly from my youth, although I'm not sure exactly why. It's hardly gone down in the annals of gaming history as a bona fide classic. I'm blaming my brother. We were always on the lookout for 2-player games, and the funky graphics and punk-inspired protagonist probably made us think that this was a cool game and these were cool dudes. They're not, and the game probably just is a little bit silly, to be honest. The American president, with the most powerful military the world has ever known at his disposal, chooses to send 2 background extras from an 80s music video to New York City to secretly clean up the streets after a nuclear explosion. Why this task would have to be undertaken in secret is never explained, and given that your character starts the game by crashing through a brick wall, I'm not sure if covert ops is really their specialty. The Big Valley organisation, it turns out, is run by a mad scientist, presumably choosing to set up his facility in a post-apocalyptic New York because, as we all know, nuclear fallout mutates things into cool creatures, and maybe he was hoping to capitalise on this? I'm shrugging my shoulders in case you wondered. So the game is daft, and the name Crude Buster to me seems like one of the silliest names for a game I've heard. I suspect it stems from the Japanese tendency to choose English words that bear some relation to the meaning you're trying to convey, but they're not quite right. Also, why is it Crude Buster? When there's 2 of them, they're on all the title screens, they're a duo. It should be Crude Busters, surely. And I think me and my brother must have made this correction between ourselves back in the day, because I was sure it was Crude Busters, plural, until I started hunting around for it. 2 Crude isn't much better, and nor is 2 Crude Dudes in my opinion. But despite the game's silly name and premise, it's a lot of fun to play. The key selling point is the destructible and interactive environments. You can pick up burnt out cars, lampposts, street signs and more, hurling these at enemies, or simply use drain pipes as oversized truncheons. You can even pick up the bad guys themselves or your co-op partner, chuck each other at the enemy, the latter leading to much consternation because it usually happened by accident, didn't it, Matt? Didn't it? There's a great deal of enemy variety. Wacky is a word that springs to mind, from radiation-suited dudes with flamethrowers to steroid-infused weightlifters to an assortment of maniacs riding jet bikes. But the bosses are mid-level enemies, all of which you'll encounter again on later levels, slightly depowered but still tough to beat. These are the highlights. Psycho Santa is easily the best. He throws knives and syringes at you, the latter of which were taken out for the Western release because we are a bit sensitive over here. Another favourite of mine is the very difficult Spider Boss on level 5, who has a couple of moves that insta-kill you. This ability to ruin your day isn't just confined to the bosses either. The bog standard enemies have moves that vary wildly in damage output, with kung fu guys who can take you down to 0 health in one kick. The wrestler's belly flop also does this. Both of these characters and others seem obviously out of balance with the rest of the game. I think it's a little bit of a flaw of the game. And this is probably a good time to mention the cheese also. There's plenty of it, and it's hard to see how to counter certain attacks other than attacking in the short window of invincibility the game grants you after death. One thing I had forgotten all about was the music. I think it's really good. It's hammy 80s guitar rock, but there were several occasions when it really stood out to me. Not something that happens all the time during frantic action beat-em-ups. I played Final Fight recently and I remember nothing about the music for that game except that it had some. Crude Busters has some genuinely catchy tunes. I can see why it never became a classic though. It's not that innovative apart from the environmental weaponry, and its zany design and story ultimately come across as lacking coherence to me. It's also incredibly short, with the levels being over in a flash, and only the game's difficulty accounts for any longevity it might have had in the arcades. In conclusion, Crude Buster is a grab bag of different concepts: a nuclear apocalypse, a mad scientist, street gangs who also have access to helicopters and tanks, Santa Claus, a guy who uses snakes as whips, and 2 rejects from an MTV music video as the game's protagonists. But the core gameplay keeps you engaged, and the game's brevity may even be a plus for returning players who just want to blast through something and have some fun. These 2 crude dudes may have been ultimately runners-up in the battle for beat-em-up glory in the early 90s, but they gave it their best shot. What a day! What a day. Thank you all for watching and your continued support. More videos that you might like to watch coming up, more retrospectives, reviews and whatnot. Really enjoying playing through these old games and learning stuff. I hope you are too. Any thoughts? Leave them in the comments and I'll see you next time. Bye!